Imagine standing on your own front porch as the locks are changed and your suitcases are tossed onto the pavement. Now imagine that your own children, the ones you raised and sacrificed everything for, are the ones holding the keys to the moving truck. Arthur and Martha thought they had a family to lean on, but instead, they were left with nothing but a rusted car and a map to a place that didn't even exist on modern GPS. They were being sent to die in the wilderness, or so their children thought. But high up in the jagged peaks of the Blackwood Range, something was waiting for them. Something that would turn their heartbreak into a fortune and make their children regret the day they ever turned their backs. This is not just a story of survival, it is a story of a legacy reclaimed from the dust. The morning sun felt colder than usual as it crept over the manicured hedges of the suburbs. Arthur sat at the small kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he held a lukewarm cup of tea. Opposite him, Martha was staring at a stack of legal documents that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. They had spent 40 years in this house. They had measured their children's heights against the doorframe in the hallway and hosted every Christmas dinner since 1985. But today, the house no longer belonged to them. Their eldest son, David, had convinced them to sign over the deed 2 years ago, promising it was a move for tax protection and long-term security. He had looked them in the eye and told them he would always take care of them. Now, David was selling the property to a developer to fund a new business venture in the city. Their daughter, Sarah, had simply stopped answering their calls, claiming she didn't want to get involved in family drama. The betrayal was a sharp, physical pain in Arthur's chest. He looked at Martha, whose eyes were red from a week of silent weeping. They were in their late 70s, and the world they knew was vanishing. By noon, a moving crew arrived. They weren't there to help Arthur and Martha pack, they were there to clear the house for the new owners. David appeared briefly, wearing an expensive suit and checking his watch every 30 seconds. He didn't look at the family photos being tossed into cardboard boxes. He only looked at the clock. When Arthur tried to speak to him, David sighed with an air of practiced exhaustion. He told them they were being dramatic. He reminded them that he had arranged for them to stay in the old mining cabin their grandfather had bought back in the 40s. It was a shack in the mountains, 3 hours away from the nearest town, and it hadn't been inhabited for decades. To David, it was a convenient place to put people he no longer found useful. As the sun began to set, Arthur and Martha loaded their few remaining possessions into their aging estate car. Their golden retriever, Buster, sensed the tension and sat quietly in the back seat, his head resting on a pile of blankets. They drove away from the life they had built, leaving behind the ghost of a family that had chosen greed over love. The drive into the mountains was treacherous. The paved roads eventually turned into gravel, and the gravel turned into narrow, winding dirt tracks overgrown with weeds. The air grew thin and the temperature dropped. By the time they reached the cabin, it was nearly midnight. The structure was a ruin. The porch had collapsed, the windows were shattered, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglected snow. It wasn't a home, it was a grave. Martha sat in the passenger seat and finally let out a sob that broke the silence of the forest. Arthur reached over and took her hand, his grip firm despite his own fear. He whispered that they were still together, and as long as they had their breath, they had a chance. They spent the first night huddled in the car, watching the shadows of the tall pines dance in the moonlight. The first month in the mountains was a brutal lesson in the reality of their situation. The cabin was even worse than it had appeared in the dark. Rain leaked through the roof, and the floorboards were rotted through in several places. There was no electricity, and the old well behind the house produced only a muddy, metallic sludge. Arthur spent his days scavenging for dry wood and trying to patch the holes in the walls with scraps of tin and plywood he found in the surrounding brush. His back ached constantly, and his hands were mapped with blisters and cuts. Martha, once the queen of a modern kitchen, now cooked over a small cast-iron stove, learning how to stretch their meager supplies of flour and canned goods. They were isolated, forgotten by the world, and struggling to survive the encroaching cold. Their children had not called once to check if they were even alive. Hunger began to gnaw at them. Their small savings were dwindling, and the car was nearly out of fuel. Arthur knew that if they didn't find a way to make the cabin habitable before winter, they wouldn't last until spring. He felt a deep sense of failure. He had worked his whole life to provide, and now he was watching his wife shiver in a drafty shack. One afternoon, while Arthur was trying to clear a path through the dense thicket behind the cabin, Buster began to bark frantically. The dog was digging at a patch of dark, oily earth near a rocky outcropping. At first, Arthur ignored him, thinking the dog had found a rabbit hole. But Buster wouldn't stop. He was whining and pawing at the ground until his claws were black. Arthur walked over to pull the dog away, but as he reached down, he noticed something strange. The soil wasn't just wet, it was slick. He knelt down and rubbed the earth between his fingers. It had a peculiar, pungent smell. It reminded him of the old stories his grandfather used to tell about the mining claims in these mountains. People had come here looking for gold, but they had missed what was right under their feet. Arthur spent the next few days digging deeper into the spot Buster had identified. He unearthed a hidden vent of deep, rich peat moss, but beneath that lay something far more valuable. It was a natural spring, but the water was different. It was warm, bubbling up from deep within the earth, and it carried a crystalline clarity he had never seen. He realized the cabin was situated directly over a geothermal vein and a pristine mineral source. While their children had dumped them in a wasteland, they had inadvertently handed them a hidden treasure. Arthur didn't tell Martha yet, he needed to be sure. He spent his nights studying the old land surveys his grandfather had left in a rusted tin box under the floorboards. The more he read, the more he realized that this ruined property was actually the gateway to a massive, untapped natural resource. The turning point came when a local forest ranger stumbled upon their cabin while investigating a reported campfire. The ranger, a young man named Elias, was prepared to tell them they couldn't squat on the land, but when he saw the legal deed Arthur produced, his attitude changed. He looked at the work they had done to the cabin and then at the spring Arthur had uncovered. Elias was an amateur geologist, and he was stunned by the quality of the mineral water. He told Arthur that companies paid millions for access to springs like this. More importantly, he explained that the heat from the geothermal vein could be harnessed to power the entire property. For the first time in months, Arthur felt a spark of hope that wasn't just about survival. He felt the stirrings of a plan. With Elias's help, they reached out to a small, independent bottling company in the valley that was looking for a new source of high-end mineral water. When the representatives from the company arrived, they were skeptical. They saw an elderly couple in tattered clothes living in a shack. But then they tasted the water and saw the thermal readings. They offered Arthur and Martha a partnership on the spot. They didn't want to buy the land. They wanted to lease the rights and build a sustainable facility that would leave the mountain untouched. The contract included a massive upfront payment and a percentage of every bottle sold. Suddenly, the couple who had been discarded like rubbish were the owners of a booming enterprise. They used the first influx of money to transform the cabin. They didn't tear it down, they restored it. They brought in master craftsmen who used local stone and timber to turn the ruin into a breathtaking mountain estate. They installed floor heating powered by the earth and glass walls that looked out over the peaks. The shack was now a paradise. Word of their success eventually trickled down to the city. A local newspaper ran a story about the miracle of the mountain, featuring photos of the stunning new villa and the thriving business. It didn't take long for the phones to start ringing. David called first. His voice was smooth, full of false warmth, as if he hadn't been the one to change the locks on their home. He talked about how worried he had been and how he was planning a visit to help them manage their new wealth. Sarah followed shortly after, crying over the phone about how she had been going through a hard time and missed her parents terribly. Arthur listened to their excuses with a heavy heart. He saw through the thin veil of their sudden affection. They didn't want their parents, they wanted a piece of the mountain. He invited them both to the cabin for a weekend, promising they would discuss the future of the estate. The confrontation was inevitable, and Arthur was finally ready to stand his ground. The weekend of the family reunion was overcast and chilly. David arrived in a sports car that struggled with the mountain path, while Sarah appeared in designer hiking boots that had never seen a speck of dirt. They walked into the restored cabin, their eyes widening at the luxury. The interior was filled with light, the smell of cedar, and the sound of the bubbling spring. They sat at a long, hand-carved wooden table, looking at their parents. Martha served them tea, her movements graceful and her face serene. She no longer looked like the broken woman who had wept in the car. She looked like a woman who had found her soul again. David wasted no time. He began laying out financial documents, suggesting that at their age, Arthur and Martha shouldn't be burdened with such a large business. He proposed a family trust that would put him in control of the assets. Arthur let him finish. He sat silently as Sarah chimed in, talking about how they could all live here together and how she could help market the mineral water to her social circles. When they finally stopped talking, Arthur stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the forest. He told them about the first night in the cabin. He described the cold, the hunger, and the feeling of being discarded by the people he had loved most in the world. He reminded them that when they were at their lowest, their children were nowhere to be found. He told them that Buster had been more of a son to him than David had been. The room went silent. The shame was palpable, but even then, it was overshadowed by their desperation for the money. David tried to argue, claiming he had done them a favor by giving them the cabin in the first place. That was the final straw. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a legal envelope. He hadn't spent his money on just luxury, he had hired the best lawyers in the country. He informed David and Sarah that he had already established a foundation. The entirety of the mountain estate and the business profits were legally bound to a charitable trust dedicated to providing housing for the elderly who had been abandoned by their families. He told them that they would not receive a single penny of the inheritance they were so clearly hunting for. Furthermore, he revealed that he had looked into the sale of their original home and found the legal discrepancies David had used to trick them. He wasn't going to sue his own son, but he was going to ensure that David had no further claim to any family assets. Sarah began to wail, and David turned a shade of red that matched his car. They realized that the bridge had not just been burned, it had been vaporized. They were asked to leave before sunset. As they drove away, Arthur and Martha stood on their beautiful stone porch, watching the taillights disappear into the mist. The silence that followed their children's departure was not a lonely one, it was peaceful. For the first time in years, the weight of expectation and the sting of betrayal had lifted. Arthur and Martha had realized that family isn't always defined by blood, but by who stands beside you when the world turns dark. They spent their days overseeing the foundation, which began to bring in other seniors who had found themselves in similar situations of neglect. The mountain became a sanctuary. The ruined cabin was now the heart of a community where age was respected and stories were valued. They built small, beautiful cottages nestled among the trees, ensuring that no one would ever have to shiver through a winter night alone. They had turned their personal tragedy into a legacy of hope for hundreds of others. The mineral water business continued to thrive, but it was no longer about the money for them. It was about the life it enabled. Arthur and Martha spent their evenings sitting on the porch, watching Buster run through the tall grass. They had learned that the most valuable resources aren't always gold or oil, sometimes, they are the strength found in a partner's hand and the resilience of the human spirit. They had been pushed to the edge of a cliff, and instead of falling, they had learned to fly. They were no longer the elderly couple, to be managed or hidden away. They were the guardians of the mountain, the architects of a new kind of family. They had found paradise not by escaping their problems, but by digging through the dirt of their despair until they hit something pure. As the years passed, the mountain changed. The trees grew taller, and the gardens Martha planted became a riot of color against the gray stone. They never heard from David or Sarah again, and while there was a lingering sadness, it was tempered by the joy of the people they had helped. They had taught the world a lesson that their children had failed to learn, that you cannot build a future by destroying the people who gave you a past. The story of the mountain cabin became a legend in the valley, a reminder that it is never too late to start over and that the most beautiful things often grow from the ruins of what we thought we lost. Arthur and Martha lived out their days in the warmth of the earth they had reclaimed, finally at home, finally at peace. Sometimes, life has to break us down to the very foundation just to show us what we are truly made of. Arthur and Martha were abandoned by the people who should have loved them most, yet they found a wealth that money could never buy. They proved that your value isn't determined by your age or your circumstances, but by the courage you show when everything is taken away. If you are going through a dark time, remember that even in the ruins of your life, there might be a spring of hope waiting to be discovered. Don't let the world tell you that you are finished. Like the mountain cabin, you can be restored, and you can turn your greatest struggle into your greatest paradise. Thank you for listening, and may you find the strength to dig for your own hidden treasures.